Thank you, Matt. I'm Halima Amjad, a geriatrician and assistant professor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine here in Baltimore. Like many of you, I have personal experience with FTD. In my case, I supported my mother, who served as the primary caregiver for my father, from his diagnosis of primary progressive aphasia in 2009 until his passing just last month. Everyone in this room today is tied together by this disease, but our experiences are our own, and they vary significantly based on our cultural background, socioeconomic status, geographic location, and more. Today, we've brought together a panel of people who share a common link, FTD, but who bring their own opinions, perspectives, and backgrounds to bear on their FTD caregiving journeys. Joining me for this panel discussion are Aisha Adkins, who is joining us virtually, Rachel Castellanos, Bob Powers, and Abrar Tanveer. Thank you all for being here. I'll start by having each of our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Aisha online. Oh, Aisha, we can't hear you here in the room. I'm assuming someone's working on that. We'll have you try again. Okay, so we still can't hear you, so what I will do is have our panelists here who are here in the room start introducing themselves, and then hopefully if we come back to you, we can hear you better. Okay. Bob, why don't we start with you?
I'm Bob Powers. My husband was Donald Clement. He was diagnosed with PPA in 2013. He died this past August. He was the sweetest man in the world. We lived in Portland, Oregon. Obviously, we were a gay couple. Donald was 62 when he was diagnosed. The PPA was very slow moving, but the dementia aspect just tore through him in the last couple years. We live in an area with a fair amount of resources, and fortunately we had resources, and also we had long-term care insurance to help get through this. So anyway.
Abrar?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Abrar Tanveer. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. My relationship to FTD is through my father, Shaquille Tanveer. He was diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia in the summer of 2016 before he passed away in December of 2019. I come from a very large Pakistani Muslim American family, one of 3 siblings. My aunt, my other aunt, and my uncle and my grandparents all live in the same city, which is both a blessing and a curse depending on who you ask. But we had access to a lot of resources due to the community we had. As of right now, I'm kind of in the grief stage and just really excited to kind of be here and share my story. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. And Rachel?
Hi, good morning. My name is Rachel Castellanos. My mother, Mary, was diagnosed with the PPA variant of FTD in 2013, around the age of 60. But like many others, was probably living with the disease and its side effects well before that. Currently, she's in the later stages of the progression and mostly bedbound and unable to talk or perform any activities of daily living. She's at home, and my father is a full-time caretaker for her, along with hired caretakers to help him out. I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and my parents live in New Orleans, Louisiana, about an hour away from me. I got involved in AFTD, the organization, shortly after my mom's diagnosis because I was just craving information and craving answers and other people to talk to. And it was addicting, truly. Once I got involved, I just wanted to do more and learn more and meet more people. I've participated in support groups, I've held meet and greets, and I was a regional coordinator for AFTD for a few years, and it's been an amazing experience. I'm really happy to be here today.
Great, thank you. And it sounds like we're still working on Aisha's audio, so we'll have her introduce and sort of join when she can. But the first topic we'll talk about as a group is diagnosis. What do you think, if anything, impacted your family's ability to get an accurate diagnosis? We'll start with you, Rachel.
My mother, like most other people, didn't get an accurate diagnosis initially. When we finally were able to get her to the doctor's office, a neurologist, she was diagnosed with a stroke, and her condition kept deteriorating, and we were looking for more answers, but the first neurologist wasn't really helping out and giving us more information or willing to look further. I just so happened to be working at the biggest health system in Louisiana at the time. I was working in the clinical research department, so I was very familiar with the physicians at our health system. I was familiar with all of the different departments, and it was very easy for me to find a neurologist who specialized in memory disorders because of my position. And so I think that helped us in many respects get my mom a diagnosis a little bit earlier than some others would be able to. But I know for many others, they struggle for a lot longer than just the year, I think, that we had the misdiagnosis.
And Bob, I was hoping you could also talk about any challenges that you faced in getting a diagnosis.
Do we have 8 or 10 hours? No, actually the diagnosis came fairly easily. Donald recognized he was having problems getting words out of his head. I noticed it too. His family doctor sent us for testing, and we were referred to a neurologist. And the neurologist, I remember him saying, I think it's PPA, but it'll take a couple years to pass before we can identify this. Donald didn't hear that. I heard it. And then a couple years passed. We both wanted to know what's going on. And I remember the neurologist saying, you have primary progressive aphasia. I put my hand on his knee sort of as a comfort measure. And he smiled, and he was so happy to know what it was that was driving him so crazy for the past couple years. He didn't look to the future, however.
Thank you. And how does your community, however you think of or define community, support care and caregiving? Are there specific resources or services that you needed, and were they available? We'll start with you, Abrar.
Yeah, so for myself, I was really supporting my mom, who was the primary caregiver. I think I was in a very fortunate circumstance in which not only my brothers were kind of home, I was in college away, but they were there to help her, as well as my aunts, my grandmother and stuff. I think when it came to resources, we relied a lot on our Islamic community because a lot of them are doctors, to try and recognize who should we get in touch with, where can we find help and stuff. But at the end of the day, it was all through word of mouth. I didn't even realize AFTD was an organization until after my father passed, and I was like, gosh, I wish I knew about these resources later. So we relied a lot heavily on like word of mouth, support of friends and family, and I can't thank them enough for their help. But that was really the ways we kind of went about finding resources. But I do remember the challenges when we kind of came together as a family, being like, we need this, how can we find it, and going about it from that perspective.
And Bob, what was your experience with, your community and the services or supports that you needed?
Well, I had a very strong network of family and friends who were supportive. Donald also decided early on to let everybody know he had been diagnosed with aphasia, and that sort of opened the door to conversation. In Portland, I was able to identify a support group, and I would say I was in that group about 6 years before he died, and it was an amazing group for me because I knew nothing about his condition, and over the years I really got very well grounded in it. And in fact, some of you may know Allison Linder. She's the head of that support group at this time, which is quite wonderful.
And Rachel?
Sure, I think right nationwide there's a lack of support and resources for people living with FTD and their family members and caretakers. But I think in the area of the country, or in the area where I live in Louisiana, we don't have a memory disorder clinic. We don't have a specialized FTD center, and the nearest one is many hours away. And so there, out of all of the people with FTD that I've met in southern Louisiana, they all have seen pretty much the same one doctor. And I'm sure there are other physicians in the area that have diagnosed people with FTD, but when there's only one or two doctors treating patients in the area, that trickles down to the support services, right? So the nursing homes, the memory care facilities, the social workers, the hospice agencies, their familiarity with the disease and what type of support patients living with the disease and their family members need is lacking. Lack of support groups, just lack of support in general in our area. And I know, again, this is not unique to southern Louisiana, it is nationwide, but I think when you live in an area of the country that doesn't have a specialized center, it's more than just the medical care that you don't get specialized care, and you're also not receiving those resources and support in other ways.
Okay. For the next question, Bob, we'll have you answer first. Were there any challenges or decisions you faced that you think were particularly difficult or unique for you or your family?
This is the area I could go on for hours. Most people meeting Donald would describe him as the kindest man they ever met with a great smile. This sweet man became the most agitated person you could imagine in the last year of his life. He basically went crazy, and that was partly the dementia, but it was also the fact that even though we had researched a memory care facility, and it was a very pricey one and a very beautiful one, they were ill-equipped to handle dementia care patient. They were ill-trained, understaffed, and I realized that I had to become the primary advocate and know more information than they did. I had so many other challenges. I raised money. My husband was an architect, and I raised money to build some homes in Africa in his honor. I had been in the Peace Corps in Africa. We raised over $30,000, more than enough to build these homes. My bank canceled my account because they thought I was being scammed. And this was all during the last months of his life. On 3 occasions, this facility sent Donald off in handcuffs and restraints to a mental hospital because they always rushed at him, and he would ward them off. He would sort of like go like that, and they thought he was trying to attack them. And they didn't understand. And the ambulance took him to the wrong hospital on 2 different occasions, which cut off his hospice care. It was a nightmare for the last 6 months of his life. I eventually brought him home the last week of his life, and that was wonderful. He died in my arms, me telling him how much I loved him, what a wonderful man he was, what a kind man he was, and what a wonderful husband. But that was a brief period of a horrible, horrible year. So the challenges were extraordinary, and they were all unnecessary. I mean, what was necessary was dealing with his disease. These other challenges were just very difficult to handle.
And if I may ask just a follow-up to that is, how did you handle those challenges, or how did you cope with it?
That's a great question. I handled each of them separately. With the memory care unit, I sued them, and a very small amount, because they charged for replacing the carpeting and baseboards in his room. They said he urinated too much. I said it would take an elephant to urinate that much. And then they charged me $4,000. I took him to small claims court, and they paid a check. They didn't even fight it. The Oregon Ombudsman, I hired an ombudsman to help me with the memory care unit. I got a person who was literally insane. I could go, and during break, ask me about it. I ended that one by finally, well, I realized the hospice people, when I told the hospice people about it, they said, well, is it so-and-so by chance? I said, yes, how do you know? Well, it's not the first time. And I got a hold of her supervisor, and I gave him enough information I felt I could leave that. The bank, I moved my bank to another bank. I got friends to move their bank. That felt good. And the ambulance company, they wanted to charge me. And I said, no, you took them to the wrong hospital. You did this and that. And they didn't believe me, except the hospice nurse had heard the memory care nurse tell them where to go. And once I had that information, they backed down. And they not only returned the monies I had paid, but they trained not just the people, the ambulance drivers that had taken him to the wrong hospital, they retrained all of their ambulance drivers. So again, all this was done during the last months of Donald's life, but I felt, and some thereafter, but I felt finally that I was able to finish all these things and let go and just grieve, you know. I'm glad you had a follow-up question.
And Abrar, if you could touch on any, unique or difficult challenges that you or your family faced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you ask anybody, you could throw my dad in a room of strangers and he would come out becoming best friends with all of them. And so he helped establish the Islamic Center, Greater Cincinnati, which is a very large Muslim community. And he was a very prominent, figure in that space. And so I remember it got to a point, my brothers and I started walking more with our father and having to explain more oh, I'm sorry. He just can't really comprehend. And I remember specifically one time I kind of just told somebody, I was just like, I'm sorry. There was a man visiting from out of town. I'm like, my father, he has this disease now, and I'm sorry, but I don't think he'll be able to speak with you. And just seeing the person's face kind of wash over and be like, your father was an incredible man. I'm really sorry to hear that. And so I think the stigmas and challenges are just trying to figure out when and where to explain it, especially as the disease progressed, because it doesn't get easier, it gets harder. And the challenges of just coordinating care, finding somebody to come to the house at a certain time, helping them with small things. But I think the real difficult decisions was kind of just, I'm very close to my family, having discussions of being like, can we take him to this wedding? Can we take him to the dinner? What do we do in this situation? And then I think the discussion I think about most was I was at a table with my aunts, my uncles, and my mom, and we had a long discussion being he needs long-term care facility now. And then trying to figure out how we can get him into that because as we know, Medicare isn't easy to work with. And so, the challenges were just constantly something new popping up, and I'm really thankful that I have my family to lean on during those times because it was really tough just trying to figure out what we needed to do in those moments and coordinating care from there.
And Rachel, are there any sort of unique or difficult challenges or decisions you feel like you've encountered along the way?
Sure. I think, from my personal experience, my mom was diagnosed with FTD shortly before I started my own family. And so just entering motherhood without having your mother to guide you was unfortunate and saddening and challenging at times. And now that my children are old enough to somewhat understand my mom's condition, navigating what the right way to explain it to them is, how much to expose them to, what can they handle, answering difficult questions about death. My 5-year-old asked a lot of questions about death, and I don't know whether it's related to my mom at all or not. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't, but just navigating those issues that you never thought you would have to navigate with young children.
Thank you. And I think we now have, and hopefully we can hear you too, Aisha, so I was gonna have you just introduce yourself, and then I might pose some of the same questions to you so you can kind of catch up and share your story with everyone.
Certainly, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. So my name is Aisha Adkins, and as I mentioned previously, if you could hear me then, I coming to you from Cherokee Nation, also known as Atlanta, Georgia, where I have provided care for my mother since she was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, likely behavioral variant, in 2013. The journey was certainly a challenging one, but I have learned a tremendous amount over the course of the last nearly decade. Primarily, what it means to be a young adult, tasked with this role of providing care to your loved one, and what that then means from the perspective of a greater society at large, and how that impacts our quality of life and how we move about our community.
Thank you, Aisha. I'm glad we have you now. So some of the topics we talked about already, and I would be welcome your comments on it too, are any challenges that you guys faced in getting an accurate diagnosis, and then also, how your community supports care and caregiving.
Most certainly. Well, gaining an accurate diagnosis was certainly my highest priority at the time, but a challenging one. Our first visit with a neurologist who was a white man, we left with a diagnosis of menopause-related stress, despite my mother performing quite poorly in the mini cognitive test. And I immediately knew that more needed to be done. What I fear is that, unfortunately, this particular physician allowed the biases that he held, which we all have, to interfere with his ability to accurately diagnose my mother, based on the fact that he may not have been listening to her and may not have been listening to her family when we presented her symptoms and our concerns about her changes in behavior and her short-term memory loss, and all of these other kind of telltale signs that were red flags to us. We all have biases as we move through society, but it's a strength to be able to recognize that and then actively educate yourself and work against those biases in the work that you do and in your everyday life. But unfortunately, he allowed his gender and racial biases to interfere with that process. So I went on the quest to find additional diagnoses. It led to initially an Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's diagnosis, but that did not align with my mother's age or her symptoms. So a final try led us to frontotemporal dementia, and that's something that we felt that was better aligned with what we were experiencing. But it certainly took time and money. We were not insured as a family during this time. We were still recovering from the Great Recession. So there were a lot of challenges associated with it.
Okay, great. And then our other question was just how you've handled caregiving and how you've sort of handled it within your wider community.
Caregiving is something that I was wholly unfamiliar with, perhaps partially given my age at the time of my mother's diagnosis. I was 27, she was 57. And it's simply not, we've heard panelists and speakers today share about the importance of nomenclature and the language that you use, but caregiver was not a term that I had called being familiarized with prior to my mother's diagnosis, and really her primary care physician bringing up caregiver burnout to myself and my father. So once I gained that understanding of that terminology, I was able to access a whole new world of care and really base a lot of research, whether it was just kind of your own, internet searching or other resources. It allowed me to figure out what I was looking for. I initially noticed an absence, however, of younger voices and experiences of those of Black and Brown communities, of LGBTQ communities, in a lot of the more readily accessible resources, or readily accessible or existing groups, support groups and the like. So I really, over the last many years, I've focused on cultivating and seeking out communities wherein I share more in common with its members than solely a diagnosis. That's certainly a starting point, but also being able to relate on lived experience and phase of life has also been vitally important as well. And there are so many places to find those meaningful connections, but certainly more can be done to make sure that these environments are sustained, because isolation, caregiver isolation is real, and it's very important to make sure that that we are continually supported, and that we have access to these communities.
Great, thank you. And we all know that stigma is a common challenge in FTD. Rachel, where or how have you encountered stigma?
Sure, I think stigma came directly related to our situation with respect to my mom's diagnosis and her ability to admit that something was wrong. Like I mentioned before, she was living with symptoms of the disease for several years before we actually went to the doctor's office. And when the moment came for us all to have that moment to acknowledge that something needs to be done, we need to get to a physician's office, we need to get some answers and some help. She had indicated that she knew something was wrong, and she had known something was wrong for quite some time. And just that fear that she had of asking for help, for reaching out for help, for seeking answers, because it was something to do with her cognitive abilities, something to do with her brain. I think unfortunately today there's still stigma surrounding brain health. And unfortunately for my mom's situation, I think it delayed her ability to get care and help and support, both medical and support from family members that she could have probably really used much earlier.
Thank you. And Aisha, I was hoping you could also just touch a little bit on stigma and where or how you've encountered it.
Most definitely. I think, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of combating ageism and ableism, and the way that we perceive those who are experiencing cognitive declines, cognitive changes. And there are so many things that I think most people wouldn't take into consideration. So for my mother, you know, she has always been very actively involved in her church, in our church, and she had always had a beautiful voice and has been a lovely singer. She so enjoyed getting dressed up in her Sunday best. When she really began to exhibit the symptoms associated with figuring out how to put together, you know, what we would view as matching combinations of outfits, or doing her makeup, you know, putting on things like pantyhose and high heels, became significant challenges for her. And, you know, I really didn't know, I didn't have the skills yet to assist her with that process. So I recall one time, you know, we went to church, and perhaps her slip was showing just a bit. And while I understand the importance of protecting my mother's dignity and making sure that I upheld the value of modesty that was dear to her, someone from the congregation approached me and kind of scolded me because she said that, you know, my job was to make sure that my mother looked a certain way in public. And I was so taken aback by that, because she didn't understand just how difficult it was to arrive in church that day. And it was definitely a challenge. And while there's so many people who are unconditionally loving, it is moments like those that do make you, as a family, kind of reconsider the ways in which you interact with members of your beloved community, whether it's a faith community or some other type of group that you may have been involved in, or family or friends, because you are so concerned about the way that your loved one will be perceived and therefore treated. And so that's certainly been our experience. And as a result, we kind of have now isolated, and we like each other's company. So that's definitely a benefit. And I've had a lot of quality time with my family, but it's also unfortunate that those sorts of experiences have deterred us from being more fully engaged.
You know, I appreciate you sharing that. As you say that, I'm just thinking of the moments we experience the same thing and they stay with you, you know, years after they've occurred. So our closing question that I'll ask all of the panelists to address, and we'll start with Bob, is what have you learned along the way that you'd want to share with others? What has been helpful in your journey?
If somebody would have told me I'd be a good caregiver, I would have laughed. I thought I was way too selfish. I was a very good caregiver, and I learned patience. It was probably, that would be a quality I would have thought I was pretty bad at, but you know, you learn patience with this disease. I think even more importantly, I'm more a compassionate person. I'm more empathetic, and I understand grief, and I never understood grief. And most people don't, you know. They don't know even what to say to a person grieving. And I learned there's only one thing you can say. You know, I'm sorry that you're in pain, because grief is pain. And I'm fortunately a part of a gay and lesbian 2,000 member grief group, which is extraordinary. And they meet twice a day. I go on every day to read these various posts. And it just is inspiring, and it helps me continue on this path of feeling like I'm coming out of this horrible group of years.
Thank you. And Abrar, what have you learned along the way, or what's been helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, what I've learned along the way is that it's hard. It's never really truly easy. It's always kind of difficult. I've learned that it's important to just rely on loved ones, and kind of like Bob mentioned, like I'm now much more empathetic, I think, and I understand just there's always something else kind of going on within somebody's life, whether you recognize it or not. I think like I'm also a lot more positive now, and I think the reason being is that I remember at my father's funeral afterwards, it was at the masjid, and there was a lot of people there. And somebody came up to me, and they were holding their kid, and they walked up. They're like, "Hey, you're Abrar, you're Shakil's son, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "You know, I just wanted to say, I never met your father. I like never got the opportunity to. But when I was looking for jobs, the real reason I moved here was because of this like mosque he built in this community. And I want to let you know that that impact is like gonna just affect me and my family the best way possible, and you should be proud of that." And so the reason why I'm like very positive and kind of just hopeful with AFTD in this community is that we now like recognize what we really need, and we can build those resources so that people don't have to go through the same struggles we did. And so it's why I run for marathons, and to continue to raise awareness. And I think just continually pushing forward, leaning on those you love, and trying to just advocate for yourself and find the resources you need is just the best way to keep on moving forward, I think.
Thank you. Rachel?
I think what I've learned along the way is that people want to help. People want to hear your story, and quite often when I have opened up and I have told someone about my family situation, there's often a connection. I mean, I was at the dermatologist's office a few years ago. I was wearing this bracelet, and she said, "My aunt has FTD." You know, I posted that I was coming to this conference today, and my son's teacher saw the post and said, "I'm caring for my mom with dementia. I would love to connect with you sometime and hear more about your experience." And then even for those who don't have direct experience caring for someone with dementia, there's empathy and compassion when you really open up and share your story, and we've found support through friends and people in our community that way.
Great, thank you. And Aisha, what have you learned along the way, or what's been helpful for you?
I have learned, in addition to what Rachel mentioned about the opportunity to connect with others who are going through a similar experience, I've learned about the importance of both education around health, overall health and disease, and how to use that education to advocate for your loved one and for yourself. I imagine that it's quite possible that I can encounter FTD, another dementia in my own life in the future. And this experience has really shown me that it's important to certainly speak up when you recognize that perhaps there's something wrong, which is what my mother did very early on, as did Rachel's mother. And I think also really understanding the importance of letting others in. People can't help if they don't know what's going on with you and if they don't know what's wrong. So sometimes it's painful or difficult to be vulnerable, but once you take that step to reach out, whether it's to professionals or to family and friends, the amount of support that you can receive it can be overwhelming in the best possible way.
Great, thank you, Aisha. And thank you to our panelists for being open to sharing your personal experiences with us. We truly appreciate your bravery and candor. I know it's a hard topic to talk about, so thank you. And at this time, Matt Sharp will join us again to share what's next.